Welcome back to the show. I'm Rick Unger, filling in for the 3-day vacationing Steve Malzberg, who's hopefully enjoying a well-deserved few days off for this Labor Day. So, as I just said, this weekend we are going to celebrate Labor Day. And you know what? This holiday isn't just about the end of summer, and it's not just about eating some really good barbecue. What it's about is celebrating the American worker. And if you're going to celebrate the American worker, you have to celebrate the American labor movement. Now, I got to tell you, I am somebody who grew up in a labor town. I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, a place that was dominated throughout most of my life by steel mills and steel workers. I spent time in those steel mills. I worked with these men and women who counted so much on their union to see to it that they got a fair shot and a fair day's pay. The question that I like to raise is whether or not in this era of declining union influence, and I'm talking really about private unions because we all know that the public unions have maybe gained a little too much influence in our country today, but the private union has really become almost something of the past. And you have to ask the question, as you look at a time when wages appear to be going down, at best they're staying static, are we suffering as a direct result of the declining influence of the private labor unions? Now, as I said, I'm a guy who's very much rooted in belief and the importance of the American labor movement. But I also recognize that we've come to a point where a great many Americans, very possibly the majority of Americans, are questioning whether or not this is something we still need in the country. I would argue that it is something we need, but I would also argue that it's entirely possible that the leadership of today's unions, the people calling the shots, have maybe got to a point where they're just not doing the job as well as they should be. They don't remind me of the labor union of eras gone by. To discuss this, I'm joined by veteran political analyst and Republican strategist. He's appeared all over television, radio, and he has columns in print. Welcome to the show, Ford O'Connell. Ford?
I'm doing great, Rick. Well, if a liberal's going to sit in Steve's seat, it might as well be you, my friend.
Well, you know, I appreciate that. You and I do this a lot, but usually on the other side, we're both visitors. Today, I get to be the host, and it's great fun. So listen, I wanted to talk a little bit about the labor movement as it stands today, because look, it is Labor Day weekend, and as the intro said, it really isn't just about barbecues. It's about celebrating labor in the United States. I'm curious how you would give us your take as to where you think the labor movement is today, particularly when comparing it to where it's come from these many years gone by. What do you think?
Well, I think on the private sector side, the labor union is certainly dying. Only 6.3% of folks are unionized in the private sector. But where they are doing very well and really the stable part of the labor base is on the public sector side, where it's about 35.3%. So labor is trying to figure out what its role is going to be and really how it can strengthen its foundation moving forward, particularly with the rising global economy. Labor's facing some tough times, and they're really trying to figure out which way to go forward.
You and I actually share a very similar point of view on this, I think. I look at the public labor sector, and you're right, it's by far the largest part of the labor movement today, as you said, some 35%. And quite frankly, I believe, like yourself, I am not a huge fan of the public unions. You have a built-in conflict. Franklin Delano Roosevelt certainly understood this. As Democrat of a president as you could possibly be, it's very hard to have a situation where the unions help somebody get elected to office and then they sit down across the table and negotiate a contract with that individual. This is problematic. What I do focus on, though, and I think you do too, is what has become of the private movement. Look, we can take a look at graphs, at charts, and we can see, going back to the mid-70s, how the advances in income among American workers has declined in a remarkably similar fashion as participation in unions. Do you think this was something that big business or even small business set out to do to make lowered wages a possibility, or do you think it was just a sign of the times?
Well, I think it was a sign of the times. That in the 70s, we had giant stagflation. So I don't know that that was what they were intending to do. Obviously, big business has long despised labor unions because at the end of the day, they feel they're paying more for the work than the output. But it's certainly come to whether or not they intended that to be the case. That is what has come about in the case. And obviously, it's a big worry overall to the labor movement because there's 24 right to work states. Secret ballots are now being pushed. And essentially, when we had a recent incursion in Tennessee, big labor got rebuffed in the private sector with respect to auto manufacturing. So they're having a tough time, and they realize if this were a presidential election, the electoral map is shrinking on them.
If you're a union supporter, how do you turn this around? Can it be turned around?
Well, the key here is that you're going to have to explain to a lot of people that the benefits of unions are going to help improve their livelihood over time. But unfortunately, I think that they've ceded that, if I were a union strategist, they've ceded that away to big business, who basically a lot of folks are out of work and looking for anything they can get. And frankly, when someone says, hey, no unions here, but we'll give you a job, that's very hard for a lot of people to turn down, particularly when we look at the latest numbers that say 1/3 of Americans are already on government assistance.
Now, I actually have a tendency to point the finger in a slightly different direction. Everything you said, by the way, is accurate. But I look at today's union leaders, and I compare them to union leaders gone by. You know, say what you will about a guy like Jimmy Hoffa, who he messed around with, who he was in business with, all that stuff. There was never a question but that Jimmy Hoffa existed for the benefit of his Teamsters. He lived among them, he was one of them, and he did everything he could to advance their situation. Today, I look at union leaders, and what do I see? I see them flying around the country in private airplanes. I see that they own resorts. This was not the union leadership of eras gone by. And don't you wonder if that isn't a big part of the problem, that maybe the union leaders see the writing on the wall and have said, hey, I'm going to get what I can get before it's all over?
Well, I think you make a very good point. I can't believe we're going to agree again here, but you're absolutely right. I really think that if you really were being neutral here, you would honestly argue that the union leadership overall nationally has done more damage to the long-term stability of the union than anything big business may have tried to do through lobbying and other tactics. And frankly, you're absolutely right. A lot of the union leaders today are more detached from the unions themselves than the actual CEOs of the businesses who are trying to thwart the unions.
It's almost like
in a lot of cases, the business leaders are more interested in the unions than the union leaders are.
That's so right. It's almost like they're trying to clone themselves into the very CEOs that they're supposed to be negotiating with, against, however you want to put it. Now, you know, I often wonder what would happen if leadership's a funny thing. You can apply this to nations, you can apply this to unions, you can apply this to almost everything. Things can change dramatically when that right union leader comes along. I thought we might have seen it with Andy Stern when he was running the SEIU. Incredibly bright guy, an intellectual mentality, actually did a pretty darn good job for his union. His membership expanded dramatically when he was running it. But you know, there was always charges, always allegations out there that the union was still using tactics that remind us of days gone by. People may be getting beat up every now and then. Do you think that the unions are still engaging in an old school approach that just doesn't really work in 2014?
I think at times, from my sources, I absolutely do think so. And I think the best case scenario is what happens when you get to card check versus secret ballots. Right. I've heard a lot of stories where the unions are engaging in this. And now that we live in a sort of YouTube, Facebook era, it's very hard for these folks to actually make sure that stuff doesn't get out. And I think it's a great reason in a lot of ways why you saw Boeing move from Washington to South Carolina to a right-to-work state, because frankly, they didn't want to have to deal with a lot of this stuff. And there's no question about it. This was bare-knuckle tactics. But that was also at a time, if you will, Rick, when we were Oliver Twist cleaning a chimney. Right. Today, there's certain safeguards that are very hard for the union leaders to overcome with respect to selling union membership to a lot of folks who are out there who are employees.
And yet, even with the difficult times the private unions are experiencing, there's still a lot of union money going into politics. How do you feel about that? Of course, as a Republican, you probably don't like it because most of that money goes to Democratic causes and candidates.
Well, that's exactly right. And here's the deal. What the unions have wound up doing, particularly on the public sector side, has become the GOTV, get out the vote arm, if you will, of the Democratic Party. And it almost becomes like heroin for a lot of the Democratic candidates, because they recognize that by supporting union goals, they themselves will stay in power and even avoid a primary challenge in the Democratic Party. So basically, backing union leadership with respect to effects at the ballot box is how unions have really stayed alive, particularly with respect to the growing numbers of the public sector unions.
But to be fair, in the short time that we have left, given the amount of money that's now available to everybody as a result of court decisions, isn't it kind of a good thing that the Democrats have the unions? Can you imagine how overwhelmed they would be if they had to face the huge sums of money going into Republican candidates without the unions to at least balance that out to some degree?
Well, this is where we're going to disagree. To me, it's not about the amount of money. Obviously, it has to be relative. But I will say what's happened here is that the Democrats, through the unions, have a very, very effective mechanism with respect to get out the vote in a way that the Republicans do not. And this is basically due to ASHME, local and municipal employees, and the AFL-CIO. If it was not for that built-in get out the vote effort, the map would look a lot more red because of that, and it's really been the lifeblood of the Democratic Party.
I'm going to let you go because we're up against a hard break, but I do want to thank you for joining us today. Hope you have a terrific holiday weekend, buddy.
You got it, my friend. Take care.
It's a pleasure to have you. So coming up next, yesterday, Steve sat down with real estate lawyer and pundit Sherry Olafson to discuss the upward trend in the housing market. Stay tuned for that.